Hello everybody, welcome to Brandon's Haunted Library. My name is Brandon, your undead librarian, and I read and talk about fantasy, literary fiction, and of course, horror. Thank you for choosing my video. Now I'm excited because today we're diving into the first episode of a new series I'm calling Silver Screams and Broken Spines, where we blend the chills of horror cinema with the thrills of horror literature. Each episode, I'll be pairing one of my favorite horror movies with a book that I think will match its vibe, hopefully. We'll explore what makes these stories click, comparing the screams on the screen with those on the page, and see if my selection ends up matching the vibe of the movie. So grab your popcorn and turn down the lights because we're starting with a slasher classic, Scream from 1996. And the book I'm pairing with it, well, you'll just have to stay tuned to find out. Now let's jump into the movie. By the time Scream was released in the mid-90s, the slasher genre was largely considered to be played out. The 70s and 80s had been the golden era for slasher films with iconic franchises such as Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street, dominating the horror landscape. However, by the 90s, these franchises had become repetitive, with sequels often leaning into self-parody or suffering from diminished returns. The slasher genre was in dire need of reinvention, and here enters our hero, Wes Craven. Wes Craven was by this point a very well-loved director in the slasher genre, as the creator of Freddy Krueger and A Nightmare on Elm Street. And with Scream, Wes Craven revitalized the genre by blending traditional slasher elements with self-aware and a comedic approach. It was the first mainstream horror movie to actively comment on the cliches and trope of slasher movies while still delivering genuine scares. The film's smart script, penned by Kevin Williamson and directed by Wes Craven, injected new life into the genre by acknowledging the rules of surviving a horror movie and then subverting them in very clever ways. Scream begins with a chilling phone call to teenager Casey Becker, played by Drew Barrymore, who finds herself in a deadly game of horror movie trivia with a masked killer known as Ghostface. The film then shifts focus to Sidney Prescott, played by Neve Campbell, a high school student still grieving her mother's murder from years before. When her small town becomes the target of a series of brutal murders, Sidney and her friends are thrown into a deadly cat-and-mouse game with the killer. As Ghostface's attacks intensifies, Sidney must confront her past and figure out who among her friends might be hiding this dark secret. This is by far one of my favorite horror movies, and what makes it so great to me is the Easter eggs and meta-commentary surrounding the slasher genre throughout the film. Characters in Scream frequently reference other horror films discussing genre rules, such as never say "I'll be right back" or "virgins always survive."
I'll be right back!
This self-awareness adds humor without sacrificing tension. In one scene, the character Randy, while watching Halloween during a house party, delivers a meta moment by shouting at the screen, "Look behind you," while in fact Ghostface was right behind him. In fact, the film's opening scene and many elements of the musical score act as a direct tribute to the Halloween movie. There are also direct references to Friday the 13th and the horror trivia between Ghostface and Casey in the opening scene. There's also a couple direct references to Wes Craven's Nightmare on Elm Street, where Sidney says the first one was good, but the rest sucked. And then a direct cameo from Wes Craven as a school janitor dressed as Freddy Krueger. Scream is not just one of my favorite horror films, it's a movie that fundamentally reinvented and resurrected the slasher genre at a time when it seemed to be on life support. Its blend of clever meta-commentary, homage, and genuine scares breathed new life into horror cinema, paving the way for a new wave of slashers in the 90s. For example, I Know What You Did Last Summer and Halloween H2O. It's a film that understands the genre's roots, celebrates its tropes, and subverts them all at once, making it a timeless classic for horror fans. I've seen this movie so many times, and I can talk about it for hours, but this video is about books. So let's jump into some of the books I considered while trying to find a book to match Scream's vibe. Earlier this year, I read a book called My Heart is a Chainsaw, written by Stephen Graham Jones, a popular author in the contemporary horror genre. This was my first introduction to Stephen Graham Jones' works and thought the writing was incredible. This book is a love letter to slasher films, and it's stuffed with references to classic horror movies and explores the genre's tropes in a way that aligns with Scream's meta-commentary. Some of the dialogue from My Heart is a Chainsaw would have fit perfectly in a comedic lines delivered by Randy in the Scream movies. But considering the fact I've already read this, and I think I can find another book that more closely matches the vibe of Scream, I wanted to see if he has any other works that might pay homage to the horror cinema or contain the type of self-aware humor that My Heart is a Chainsaw had. So first I considered his most recent novel, I Was a Teenage Slasher, which, just like Scream, is viewed from a teenage perspective and it captures the same high school atmosphere. I Was a Teenage Slasher follows a group of horror-obsessed teens who find themselves living out a real-life slasher scenario when a masked killer begins targeting their town. Sound familiar? Written from the killer's perspective, the story delves into their motivations and mindset, exploring how they navigate genre cliches in a story which I understand we are meant to root for the killer. Now, the fact that this follows a teenage masked killer really screamed out Scream franchise for me, because obviously Ghostface is a masked killer, and the killer reveals in these movies are teenagers in most of the movies except for two of them, and I won't spoil which ones for anyone. I would expect a blend of genre critique and celebration and perhaps some horror references. Plus, Stephen Graham Jones writes violence and gore in such an incredible way that I think would match the vibe well. But decided against this one in the end because I think a huge part of Scream is the mystery aspect of who is under the Ghostface mask. And since I Was a Teenage Slasher is written from the killer's perspective, and this is not exactly a mystery. So next I considered The Last Final Girl, another book by Stephen Graham Jones where he apparently flexes his love for horror cinema again. This novel centers around a final girl, a trope made famous by slasher films and is commented often in Scream, who reflects on her harrowing experiences while navigating the aftermath of surviving a brutal massacre. Written again from a teenage perspective with a blend of dark humor and horror, I understand that the story captures the essence of a slasher movie while also taking on themes of trauma and survival. The final girl trope is central to both The Last Final Girl and Scream, as both explore the resilience and strength of their heroines in the face of horror. In fact, there are 3 Final Girl books under consideration, but more on that soon. From what I understand, this follows a teenage survivor of a masked killer, but the killer returns and the story is essentially a bunch of teenage girls battling it out to be the last final girl, with a madman in a Michael Jackson mask slashing the town and chasing them. And I also hear it formatted like a horror movie script, which is something I find incredibly interesting, so I think this could be a good contender. The next Final Girl book I considered was a book simply titled Final Girls by Riley Sager, which explores the aftermath of surviving a horrific massacre. The novel follows the lone survivor of a horrific attack who has since joined a small infamous group of women known as the Final Girls. When another Final Girl is found dead, our protagonist is forced to confront her past and unravel the secrets that have kept her trapped in her trauma. While Final Girls explores the concept of the final girl in a way that resonates with the slasher genre, it diverges from Scream's tone. From what I understand, Sager's novel leans more towards psychological thriller territory that he's known for, focusing on suspense, trauma, and mystery, rather than the meta humor and slasher movie references that define Scream. The emphasis in this book is on psychological tension rather than a playful deconstruction of horror tropes. I just don't think this will match the meta horror comedy vibe I'm aiming for with the series, which leads me to the final girl book, the one I ultimately decided on reading, which is The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. This story follows a group of women who survive different slasher-style massacres. They meet in a support group, the Final Girl Support Group, to deal with the trauma of their past, until one day their quiet lives are shattered when one of them goes missing and it appears that a new killer is targeting the group. I haven't read anything from Grady Hendrix yet, but from my research I understand he's renowned for his ability to mix humor with horror in a way that's reminiscent to Craven and Williamson's playful approach in Scream. Like Wes Craven did in Scream, Hendrix seems to have fun with the genre and doesn't take himself too seriously, which is what I'm looking for in this pairing. From what I've read about the book, there is a sense that both the author and the characters understand the slasher genre's conventions and enjoys subverting or poking fun at them. This meta, self-aware tone makes me optimistic that the Final Girl support group will match Scream's vibe and bring that same balance of dark comedy and horror. Another big draw for choosing the Final Girl support group is its strong whodunit element, which feels essential to capturing the spirit of Scream. It was definitely a tough choice between all these books I considered. I think in some ways the other options might better match the vibe of Scream. The main way being this is not a teenage slasher like the other options. But I'm hoping this one will deliver the right mix of horror and humor. What do you think? Did I make the right choice? Or is there another book you suggest that might be an even better fit for Scream? Let me know in the comments below. I just rewatched Scream last night at a rooftop showing with my girlfriend who had never seen it before. So the movie is fresh in my mind, so I'm going to start reading this tonight. And I'll talk to you again after I finish, and we can talk about how well this matched up with the vibe of Scream in the end. So, I finished the Final Girl support group a couple days ago, and after organizing my thoughts, I think it's a perfect match for fans of Scream. Here's why. As I expected, this has the same blend of dark humor and meta commentary that makes Scream so iconic. Grady Hendrix obviously has a deep love for slasher movies that inspired the story, and he has an entertaining comedic writing style. The story was fast-paced, and I think if you love Scream for these reasons, you might also like this too. In the Final Girl support group, popular slashers we know and love are inspired by actual real-life events and real victims, survivors who each faced some version of a classic horror villain. That's similar to the movie Scream, where the Stab films exist within the universe as a series inspired by the Woodsboro murders, sensationalizing the trauma of the characters like Sidney Prescott. Fun fact, in Hendrix's novel, the fictional franchise is also called Stab, adding a nice touch of familiarity for Scream fans. One of the most interesting parallels is how both Scream and the Final Girl support group explores the way real-life trauma gets exploited for entertainment. And I suppose this is more true with the sequels of Scream, but in the franchise, the Stab films are criticized for how they sensationalize these horrific events, and Hendrix takes that concept even further. Here, the survivors, the Final Girls, are middle-aged now, still carrying the weight of their experiences. These women are scarred, traumatized, and frankly exhausted. And while these Scream films are largely teenage slashers, as mentioned earlier, the idea of a Final Girls in middle age is mirrored in the more recent Scream entries. One thing horror fans will love about this book is how each of the Final Girls reflect a different classic horror story. For example, the character Marilyn was attacked by bloodthirsty cannibals, and the in-book film adaptation was called Panhandle Meat Hook. Marilyn is clearly inspired by Sally from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Also, Adrian, who survived the slaughter of Camp Red Lake, is a clear reference to Camp Crystal Lake in the Friday the 13th movies. She's named after Adrienne King, who played Alice Hardy in the Friday the 13th movies, and is actually the one that reads the audiobook version of the Final Girl support group. And a not-so-fun fact, Adrienne King had her own real-life nightmare story of a stalker who would leave letters and pictures on her doorstep. This led her to install a fence within her front door, similar to what our main character does in the novel. And eventually the stalker threatens her at gunpoint before he's arrested. Our main character, Lynette, went through what the book calls the Silent Night slayings, an attack inspired by the film Silent Night, Deadly Night. In Silent Night, Deadly Night, her character seems to die when she's impaled on antlers by a Santa-dressed killer, but in the book, she survives by playing possum and endures, watching her family and friends all get murdered. Each character's backstory mirrors a different classic horror movie, including Scream, who was the inspiration for Julia Campbell. This name also being a clear homage to Neve Campbell, who played Sidney Prescott in Scream. These backstories are fascinating and well thought out, making it fun for horror fans to pick up on all the Easter eggs and appreciate how Hendrix reinvents each Final Girl story, which has a similar appeal to all the horror Easter eggs throughout the Scream franchise. Lynette's story, though, is especially intense. She thinks a lot like Sidney Prescott, but her trauma has left her hypervigilant, almost paranoid, kind of like Laurie Strode in the Halloween H2O film or the 2018 reboot of Halloween. Lynette's developed these survival habits like fearing vans, which is a nod to a scene in Scream 2, avoiding elevators, and recognizing shoes. and you can feel how much your past experience affects her daily life. But what's especially frustrating in classic horror is how no one believes her when she says she senses new danger. Just like Sydney in the Scream films, Lynette's instincts are dismissed even by the other final girls who should understand. Hendrix takes this trope to a new level of tension because Lynette's peers, the people who have survived similar attacks, are the ones gaslighting her. It makes you want to shout at the characters to listen to her already. And let's talk a bit about meta commentary because the Final Girl support group and Scream both know that their audience get horror tropes. Hendrix uses this awareness to mess with our expectations, creating twists that keep us guessing. When I started reading the Final Girl support group, I thought I had the killer figured out right away, but Hendrix makes you second guess yourself until the end. It's the same feeling you get in Scream where you think you know who the killer is only to find out you're only half correct. Finally, one of the most timely things about the Final Girl support group is how it taps into our obsession with true crime and how today the killers sometimes get more attention than the victims. Hendrix highlights how trauma of survivors can be overshadowed and commodified, much like the stab films and the Scream movies, as well as modern day true crime culture. All in all, I'd say the Final Girl support group is a must-read for Scream fans. Hendrix's blend of dark humor, horror knowledge, and that meta-awareness make it both thrilling and quite reminiscent of Scream. And if you love horror history, you'll appreciate all the winks and nods to slasher lore. I'm not sure as to whether this one matches the vibe of Scream more than some of the other options I considered, but I thought this was a great fit, and I'm really happy with my selection as a fan of Scream. But let me know in the comments, what's your favorite scary movie?
What's your favorite scary movie?
And if you've read the book or any of the other ones I considered, I'd love to hear what you thought about them. Thank you for watching the first episode of Silver Scream to Broken Spines. I hope you enjoyed watching because I really enjoyed making this. If you did enjoy this, don't forget to like and subscribe and share with your fellow horror fans. Here's a little sneak peek of episode 2. All right, I'll catch you next time. Happy reading, everybody.